Yeah, to speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. That's a line from Gary Snyder, the poet. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. Like in Lynn's meditation about Yellowstone. There's a kind of wilderness still in the middle of the United States um, that is wild and untamed and a bit frightening, alluring, and also quite whole. If you've been to Yellowstone or Hoffmaster, tiny Yellowstone, um, and you start asking, what's the problem? What would you say? Now, I know there can be some problems. There are things like human influence and erosion and invasive species and second generation trees and things like that. But to stand um, next to a geyser, what would you say the problem is? What's the problem? I just got back from Bears Ears, as I mentioned last week, in Utah, in these canyons that are older. These canyons are older than the presence of human beings in North America. What's the problem? You don't say, well, I wish the canyon was sort of shaped differently. I'd kind of like it to make a right-hand turn right here. It doesn't make any sense. Gary Snyder is getting at such an intuition by saying to speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. And then he says, and human beings came out of that wholeness. And when he says, and human beings came out of that wholeness, he doesn't mean 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia between these two rivers, we came up with something called civilization. He's talking about something much older, that's 20,000 or 40,000 or 600,000, or actually 2 million years old. We have in our bodies a kind of cellular makeup and a combination of bacteria that emerged up out of the forest in the same way that the forest emerged up out of the forest. Right? But we have iPads, so we're like, we really know what we're doing. And nature, as you know, is a self-regulating whole. It's you can slash, burn, destroy, pour chemicals into the earth, and the moment you stop, what happens? It's regenerative. Or actually, what's happening is it's constantly regenerative. You just can't see it until you stop. What is that? Now, people have different words for that, like God, universe, mystery, nature, evolution. And we can argue about terms, and I think those are worthy arguments, by the way. But it is a self-regulating mystery that expresses a certain kind of wholeness. And human beings came out of that wholeness. And what I want to talk about today is just briefly kind of a conversation about wholeness. What do we mean by such a thing? And let's ask it first in the reverse. And just nod if you think this is true. We live in a world where there's not a lot of wholeness. Would you agree? Except, of course, in politics and business. Plenty of wholeness. So we know the absence of it. We think this doesn't feel quite well-rounded or whole or even healthy. So we know the absence of it, but we don't often know how to talk about, well, then what is it? And I'm not going to answer that today, but I want to start a conversation about it. In fact, over the last 6 years or so, I've been into the work of a guy named Bill Plotkin. That's who I was with when I was in Bears Ears. He's a psychotherapist, or in his words, a psychotherapist gone rogue. And he's a writer and wilderness guide, among other things. And he's made a lot of contributions to this conversation. I'm only going to sort of talk about one portion today. So I want to actually popularize some of his work this morning. In fact, you'll see a little map that I'll refer to in a few minutes on the back. So if you get bored, you can always just look at this map while I'm talking. So on the one hand, I want to use his work and this map to start a conversation about wholeness. And it's rooted in nature itself, which you'll see in a few moments. And next week, there's actually a mistake in the bulletin. I'm teaching next week. Fable, the poet, is coming the week after. So I'm going to take one portion next week a little further, and then I'll sort of refer back to this map a couple of other times during the year, this year of Terra, the Earth's ethos. So anyway, that's just kind of where I'm going this morning. And I thought I'd start with some of Bill Plotkin's observations about contemporary culture first. He says we live in a culture that is patho-adolescent. In other words, pathologically adolescent. Would you agree? You don't even need to know what that means, and you think, yeah, that sounds true. And adolescence is an amazing, vibrant, fiery time in life. It's a gift. Actually, the gift of adolescence is actually eros and fire. And if you've ever been, like I taught high school for 6 years, and it's like the classroom is on fire every day. So it's an awesome, incredible gift to the human story, and it fits really well when you're an adolescent. What we've done is extended adolescence till death. The concerns of adolescence. And those concerns can be put in various different ways, but I'll just give you some ways of looking at it. Peer group. Where do I fit in? Sex. I don't really need to explain that. And society. Those are the concerns. Peer group, sex, and society. What kind of world do I live in? How do I navigate it? What are the social concerns? What are the roles, expectations of me? And the big tension in adolescence is the tension between authenticity and social acceptance. Again, I'm taking some of this from Plotkin's work. Authenticity and social acceptance, which if you yesterday went to the Diatribe event and you heard high school age poets, right smack in the middle of every poem was this tension, social acceptance and authenticity. It's the major question of adolescence, which is, who am I really? And also, where do I fit in? What is happening in Western culture is that we stop the pursuit, this is one of the many things that happens, we stop the pursuit of authenticity about the time we need to get serious about life, and we go to college, and we settle down, and we capitulate to the roles and norms of society. And the question of authenticity tends to go underground for a while. So in other words, we choose social acceptance over authenticity. But we never leave the concerns, meaning peer group, sex, and society. Now, if you don't believe me, just watch television and watch the news. And notice in the background of what's being said are the concerns of peer group, sex, and social roles. There's very little authenticity, correct? There's very little, I've tapped into some sort of deeper stream of who I am in the world. It's much more of, what do people think of me? How famous am I? How much money do I have? What, on any kind of social hierarchy, it doesn't matter, pick your category, the concerns are, where do I fall? Up or down? Us versus them. That's the dominant drives of our society and culture. Very little real wandering or leaving home, or in the old way of putting things, the descent to soul. This descent into the deeper dive, the true self, the deep self, one's deeper essence, that goes on the back burner. Because you got to get things done. You got to be somebody in the world. These are, William Stafford says, his way of putting it, this patho-adolescent culture, he says, the concerns are revenge, money, and fame. Those are the gods right now. Revenge, money, and fame. Those are adolescent concerns pathologized into the larger culture. Or Kendrick Lamar, what does he say? He says, sex, money, murder. These are the times. So those are little hints that, or ways of describing this pathologically adolescent culture, which all this is really good news, right? Just come to C3 and be encouraged. It's what happens when egocentric and ethnocentric culture dominate, which was sort of what I mentioned a few weeks ago. Status, safety, survival, protection, and promotion of my egoic self. be another fancy way of saying it. Protection, survival, promotion, and the status and the safety of my egoic persona is called modern life. So, why talk about wholeness? Just jump in the rat race and defend who you think you are in the world in a dog-eat-dog kind of social status kind of way. Is there a better way of being in the world? And so here are questions that emerge up out of this patholescent culture, which is, how do we grow up? If we're pathologically adolescent, how do we grow up? Really, honestly. And we know age doesn't have a lot to do with it. There's some component to age. You can only grow up by getting older. Time has to do its work, but just because you're older doesn't mean you're not still operating in a pretty small framework. Would you agree? Not you, of course, but your people you may know, right? Yeah, how do we grow up? How do we discover this deeper self, or the true self, to use Thomas Merton's great phrase, or the soul, or the voice beneath the voice? How do we move away from such immaturity, some pathological immaturity? In other words, how do we become more whole and more generative and more generous? And why do these things matter? Not so you can put it on your tombstone, I was more mature than my neighbor, because the future depends upon it. The future of your kids and your grandkids and your friends' grandkids and the future of the planet depends upon our capacity to grow up and to be generative, generous, life-giving presence in the world. And guess what happens when we don't? We tear the world apart, and our families, and our communities, and our political systems. Correct? So wholeness seems like an important conversation. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness, and human beings came out of that wholeness. One of the things I think that is worth mentioning is James Hillman. He's a Jungian. Maybe you've read some of his work, like The Soul's Code and a few others. Or he's a neo-Jungian, whatever that means. It always sounds more clever if you say you're a neo-anything, just like, oh, yeah, okay. But anyway, he has this great line. He says, 100 years of psychotherapy and we're sicker than ever. Yeah, see? Yeah, that makes sense. And he actually posits some reasons for that. Because psychotherapy is, first of all, only a little more than 100 years old. It's a very needed gift in the world. How did it start, though? It started by looking at pathologies, problems, illness, sickness, and that's what it went after. Jung spent his time with schizophrenics. So the whole discipline started with the question of what is the problem and how do we fix that? The problem is, when you only focus on the problem, you leave out questions of wholeness. What about the whole person's life, not just this particular illness, not this particular problem? By the way, I think Jesus hints around at this notion when he says, he's got this really weird line. I think it's weird, but he says, if you drive out one demon, 7 more will come. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Another related is, leave the weeds, because if you tear them out, you'll tear out the wheat with it. You've heard that before? Some version of that? What's he talking about there? He's talking, I think, a little bit about this idea that if you go totally after that one particular problem, you begin to hyper-focus on that, that becomes your identity, and you miss out on some sort of larger whole. Anyway, this is being corrected in the world of psychotherapy and other kinds of therapies, even with positive psychology. The positive psychology movement started in the 1990s, which was, they started saying, what does it look like to be happy and fulfilled? That seems like at least a little more generous than, how do I get rid of this one singular hang-up I have with my mom? Do you know what I'm saying? So in some ways, it was a corrective measure. And I think Plotkin, this is one of his books, Wild Mind, I'm going to refer to it today, and many others, including James Hillman and other creative, generous people in the world, are beginning to say, all right, let's look at the whole person. Let's look at the whole person. Are there any maps, images, and pictures for pursuing this thing rather than just the illness? Am I making sense so far? You can tell me later if I'm not, I guess. What else did I want to say about that? Oh, here's a little passage. Here's a little line from Plotkin. He says, as you know, positive psychology focuses on happiness and fulfillment. What's he interested in? Psychological wholeness, soul embodiment, spirit realization, and gratifying participation in the more than human world. That's one way of going after wholeness, which includes grief, longing, service, fears, and uncertainty as part of our wholeness, in addition to joy, delight, non-attachment, well-being, and happiness. Grief and love hold hands. You don't contact grief without love. And you really don't contact love without grief. It's part of our wholeness. It's part of the mystery of just being a whole human being. How many felt some grief this week? Okay. Why? Well, that's complicated. And you'd have your own story that's worth hearing about why. But on one level, it's because love is also involved. Love of a more generous, life-giving possibility in the world, right? And it hurts when the absence of love is not present. So a conversation about wholeness matters, I think, very much. And we need some helpful models and maps and ways of thinking about life, because right now, honestly, I was going to say every week, but every time I open my phone, I'm now addicted to the news. And maybe I was addicted before. It's called NPR. But now it's like NPR is just background noise compared to what's on my phone, this constant stream, which creates in me anxiety, fear, depression, rage, anger, and occasional numbing out when I'm like, oh, I wonder what's going on with sports, you know? But it's this steady stream coming at me all the time, and tends to suck all the energy and tends to take me personally away from a conversation about wholeness and well-being and a way of being in the world that is less reactive. And I think right now we're being given the exact same choice. Or actually, it's more of an imperative. Just be reactive. No matter what, just be reactive. And I find myself regularly in this loop. And one question we might want to ask simply is, how do we get out of this? Because this doesn't seem to be serving anybody very well. So that's a bit of a side note here. So I want to invite you to look at this map. It kind of got squashed because we were trying to save paper, just being green. Kind of got squashed a little bit there, so it looks like an oval, but it's supposed to be a circle. And I don't want you to look at it too in depth right now, but just to notice that Plotkin imagines this to be a kind of symbol or a map of human wholeness, situated in the four directions. And you'd have to go to his footnotes to see where he got this idea. It's not really his necessarily. But when you think about it, most cultures, religions, and spiritualities have some relationship with the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Native Americans are the most well-known for it because they speak about it that directly. I said to the north, or I saw a wind coming from the east, and the spirit of the east said to me. These are lines from Black Elk Speaks. But they situated the entire earth with such a thing, but it's also in the ancient religions. It's in Judaism and Christianity. Even Christianity, Jesus is put on a object with 4 points. There they are. This vertical and horizontal axis, not to mention it can be turned on its side in the four directions. What do these things represent becomes one of the questions. So he says, let's imagine that human beings for a moment, regardless of race, gender, zip code, ethnicity, spirituality or no spirituality, religion or no religion, regardless, is there something that we would call innate human wholeness? And if so, what does that look like? What does that look like? By the way, just in terms of faith, I would like to have faith that such a thing exists. Innate human wholeness. Now, I know nature is weird and doesn't even play by nature's rules sometimes. And there, sometimes people are born into the world with kinds of illnesses that seem very unfair, correct? But the vast majority of people, is there something that we would call innate human wholeness? Is it there? And how would we begin to have a conversation with it? And how, more than that, would we begin to pursue such a thing? And is that worth pursuing or not? So, this will be a bit interactive. So I'm going to try some things here, and you can just leave me hanging by not saying anything at all if you want, and you'll see how I'll deal with that. So I want to talk about first the nature component and then the archetypal component of each of these four directions, just kind of briefly. We're just doing this is like the McDonald's drive-through version of this kind of work, but it's still pretty tasty, all right? So we're going to drive through, and I first want to have a kind of imaginative response to these four directions. So first, on the level of nature, when I say the word north, what comes to mind? Okay, cold, North Star, snow, dark, northern lights. What'd you say? Recharge. Very interesting. Recharge, like the trees going to sleep and recharging for the winter. What else? Polar bears. What'd you say? Night. Also, I think about just the light-dark dynamic tension there. What? Fire. Okay. Wild. Anything else come to mind? There are wrong answers. I'm kidding. Did you say up? Someone said up? Yeah, interesting. Up north. By the way, and this works in the opposite in the southern hemisphere, but that's a whole other conversation because Pauken has done some work in New Zealand and Australia around some of this stuff. So anyway, but what was I saying? I got totally sidetracked with that. Oh, up north. Yeah, people, notice how many people in Michigan use that as an orienting way of describing their life. I was up north. And that means something other than just like I drove in the northerly direction. It means something. Or I love to be up north. Okay. What's that referring to? Okay. So, all right, that's enough. Close down the archetype, or close down the images for a moment. I have done something like this in all kinds of groups, and most of your answers are similar to other people's answers. Now, why is that the case? One response to that is because nature mirrors back to us something we recognize. And even on the deep psychological level, there's something about even the phrase north and the direction north that brings up certain things for us. Now, the argument goes, what does that correspond to within the human psyche? Now look at your map. He calls the north the nurturing, generative adult. That's the archetype. The nurturing, generative adult. And even if you think about surviving the winter, and winter is I think the right sort of image for north, what do you need to survive the winter? A nurturing, generative adult, correct? You don't need to whatever, man. Just living. No, we're not just living. We got to chop wood. We have to prepare. We have to gather things. We can't just, be cool. That's the nurturing, generative adult. Now, what's interesting is that Plotkin would say this is not something that some people have and other people don't. This isn't the Enneagram where some people are one number and other people. This isn't Myers-Briggs where you're all divided up. Every single person has a nurturing, generative adult deep in their psyches. It's part of their innate human wholeness. Now, you can not live into that, not cultivate it. That would be called most people in Washington. I'm serious. And not all people, that's true, not all people, but just as a kind of general blanket statement that makes me feel better about myself. We know the absence of a nurturing generative adult, and maybe in your own life, your own parent was neither nurturing nor generative. And you know that. You know the loss of that. So the question becomes, and I won't answer this right now, how do we cultivate a nurturing generative presence in the world? It's a facet of wholeness that is desperately needed in your life and in our culture, in our society, in our world. A nurturing generative adult would ask questions like, how do we make decisions for the next 7 generations? That's the elder, the leader, the teacher. These are other archetypes. Actually, I have a whole list of them that are associated with the North. The king or queen, the spiritual warrior, the mother, father, leader, elder. These are other archetypes that are associated with the North. It's in you. It just sometimes it has to be worked with and cultivated. Just like if you want to run a marathon, you got to train. Correct? You can't just be like, dude, whatever, man, we'll just do it next Saturday. No, you will die. Okay? Let's move to the South, because this is a drive-through. I got to go fast. It's like the Chick-fil-A drive-through. You pull up and they give you your food already. You haven't even ordered, okay? Not that I go to Chick-fil-A. Just saying. I've heard other people go there. So the South. You tell me images that come out of the South. Fire. I agree. What else? Warmth. Easy. Jungle. Humidity. Flip-flops, of course. Carefree, the light. Yeah, even if you plant, like if I say, oh, where do people plant in the Northern Hemisphere? On what hillside? The southern facing hillside, because you get the most amount of that blazing sunlight. It's the opposite. So if north is more winter, summer is, more heat. It's south oriented. And actually think about cultures. Think about the southern Spain versus Finland, culturally. There's a difference. If you've been to southern Spain and you've gone to the beach, you're like, oh, people don't wear clothes. I understand in Finland they don't wear clothes, but they're inside this little box that's very hot. So yeah, these are all true, just resonances, nature. It's like the middle of the summer in June, on June 21st, when it's just like there's so much daylight. Or if you've ever been to Alaska in the summer, which I have, it's just like almost all day long. That's very South. Okay? So what's the equivalent archetype in the human facet of wholeness? Plotkin calls the wild indigenous one. The wild indigenous one lives in you. We say, well, not me. No, in you. Actually, the South is one of the more suppressed areas of human wholeness in Western culture. Sometimes it comes out sideways, like a release valve, like Burning Man, if you've heard of Burning Man. It's there, but it comes out, it leaks out sideways because you don't have very much contact with it. North tends to be more thinking, South tends to be feeling. Full-bodied, feeling sense, wild, indigenous means of the earth, comfortable, total. One part of you, believe it or not, is totally at home, 100% home, laying down in a field with no clothes on. Seriously. You're that at home in the wild world, even if you don't have very much contact with it right this second. It's there. It's part of 40,000 years of evolution. But to suppress it means to not have very much contact with this facet of wholeness. Have I made sense? What else would I say? Some archetypes that are South-oriented. Pan. Everybody loves Pan, Artemis. The wild man wild woman or the green man, the green woman. These are archetypes in myths and stories that when they come out of usually the woods, they're like, oh no. Okay, it's very erotic, lots of eros, lots of fire, very at home in the more than human world. So that's the South. Let's keep going. Now, when I say East, what comes to mind? Mysticism, I agree. What else? Sunrise. Of course, the sunrise. Regeneration, the long view of things. What time of year? Yes, spring. Suddenly, you're like, I'm alive again. It's the death-resurrection cycle. It's the resurrection component that's more East-oriented. Easter. What else? Anything else you might say about the East? I think, maybe I said this a second ago, but the long view of things. It's like when the sun comes up in the morning and you think, one part of you thinks, I have the whole day ahead of me. What am I going to do? You know, or when spring finally arrives, you're like, whoa, I got to clean the basement or something, you know. It's the long view of things. It's the Eastern component, okay? The human archetype, Plotkin calls the innocent sage. You have within you a sage. You really do. A wise elder who's both innocent and wise. It's like the Dalai Lama. Have you ever heard him talk? He'll say profound things like Western civilization is going to hell in a handbasket, and then he'll laugh. It's hilarious. Well, how is that funny? You know? He's got that innocent sage. He's got that playfulness, but a lot of deep wisdom. He's serious and lighthearted at the same time. That's the innocent sage. Do we need more sage-like people? Yes, you are that person. It's a facet of human wholeness, and sometimes it has to be cultivated. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you have to take a look at that. So that's the Eastern component of the innocent sage. Sometimes the trickster or the fool, like if you read Shakespearean plays, the fool is the one that tells the truth. And he sort of tricks people into the truth. That trickster component is very East-like. Other things are priest, priestess, monk. These are all sort of archetypes that are very Eastern-oriented, sometimes a guide to spirit or transcendence. Very East. Like mysticism was one of the first things that came up when I asked you about what about East. So guide to the transcendent. So that's the Eastern facet of wholeness. Remember, it's in you. That's the basic argument. It's in you. Let's move to the West. What comes to mind when I say West? Frontier. Okay, frontier. So go a little further with frontier. What would you say about the frontier? It's wild, especially if in sort of American mythology, I guess. But frontier is what? The unknown. That's what I'm looking for. It's a bit unknown. It's a bit scary, really. What else about West? Yes, sunset. So now the sun goes down. Don't you feel strange when the sun goes down? What is that feeling in the body? What are those sensations? Something is ending. Have you ever felt a little grief with sunset? There's beauty and there's also a little bit of grief. Like, oh, the day is done. And I about told you, if East is more of spring, West is what? Fall. Suddenly you get a little bit sad that the days are shorter. But it's that kind of like lovely sadness. Like it kind of feels good in a way. So East might be in love with new life. West might be in love with what? Death. Yep. You know who makes a lot of West-oriented people are poets. They love to muse about death. You're like, come on, get off it already. Tell us something happy, you know? But it's a love affair. It's a love affair with the mystery of endings. Okay? The archetype is probably the hardest to understand, which is why I want to talk about it next week, only the West. So I'm not going to give you too much here. Plotkin calls it the muse, which from Greek mythology, this visitor that comes, the muse, inspiration, or beloved, the inner beloved, or the inner masculine or inner feminine, if you're a Jungian, anima or animus. that's opposite to your gender identity. This lover that is internal, that oftentimes we put onto somebody else, but it's this internal resonance that's happening. Sort of returning to a more holistic masculine and feminine. I'll say more about that next week. I'll just plant that as a little bit of a seed. So Western archetypes are, let me see here, the magician. It's a very Western kind of archetype. That's sort of like magic figure, not like David Copperfield, like Vegas. I just mean the magician as an archetype. Like, you think it's this, but it's not. The wanderer, the sort of like vagabond, wanderer. St. Francis popped into my head just from the wandering point of view. He actually embodies several different facets of wholeness that I can see. But that sort of, why don't you have shoes on? Like, what are you doing wearing essentially a bag, a grocery bag around? Like, but it awakens something in you. You're like, wait a minute, how free am I in the world? That's very West. The hermit is another image for the sort of muse beloved. So in love with nighttime, dreams, death, mysteries, and the underworld journey itself. East is very upper world. Let's all just transcend and we'll be one with the divine. And West is, let's just all go down to our own depths, psychospiritually, and wander in the underworld. Okay? It's the balance. And South and West are the most suppressed facets of wholeness in American culture. We actually want to avoid any thought of death, really, at all costs. From everything from the entire beauty industry. I'm not against, the beauty industry. I just mean you're not going to die and you're not going to get old. Buy our stuff. Okay? We don't want to go near it. Even funerals. Oftentimes you go to the funeral and it's one giant denial of death. Don't worry. They're not dead. You're like, wait, I thought that's what... Yeah. There's an element of so much denial. And some of that is just part of, we might say, just being a human being. Who is that famous scholar that said all religion is rooted in the denial of death? Who is that? Is that who it is? Yeah. So anyway, that's a bit of a side note. But this sort of the love affair with death, underworld, very West. Now, why have I told you this? Only because I wanted to give you a drive-through map. And right now, even this, the first pass at this, nod your head if you can see areas of your own life where you could cultivate a deeper facet of wholeness. Any nodding? Yeah. And we didn't even get to the immature versions. I'll say a bit about that. What's a unique thing about this work, by the way, is that what we ordinarily called complexes or problems are just immature facets of wholeness. It's a much more generous view of human beings. Yes, they have problems, but it's simply an immature facet of a human wholeness. A great one, by the way, I'll just give you a quick example and then I'll sort of wind things down here. But on the East, you see that the immature facet is the escapist or the addict. Can you see that there on the map? What's that mean? It tells you somebody who's addicted, what are they really longing for? Transcendence, which is an Eastern facet of wholeness. Connection, union, oneness, belonging. It just comes in the form of a pill or a drink or the next partner. Does that make sense to you? That has so helped me, by the way, because I tend to view people who have problems that I don't have as just being weaker. Now, I would never say that out loud, although I'm saying it out loud right now. And you probably do the same thing too. What is their problem? Clearly, I'm more on top of it than they are. That's not a very generous view of yourself or of other people. But in other words, part of the invitation here is to look at human beings differently. When I first started stumbling into this material, not only did I find it personally helpful, like, oh, there are whole areas of wholeness that I can be cultivating, it helped me change my mind about other people. I mean, what is your view of people right now? I bet if you're addicted to the news as I am, it's not that positive. And that can dominate your consciousness. And you begin to end up doing the very thing that everybody else is doing, which is dividing the world up into who's good and who's bad. Which is one of the things we're being invited to move beyond. In a much more non-dual and inclusive manner. All human beings have hang-ups. All human beings. And all human beings have capacities for wholeness. All human beings have these facets. And what kind of person are you going to be in the world? And how are you going to treat other people? Is part of, I think, the invitation that I feel in working with some of this stuff. Richard Rohr, who's been probably the longest lasting teacher in my life, meaning, I have met him before. It's not like he's like a personal friend. But one of the early things that I heard him say was, you can only take people as far as you yourself have gone. I'm like, dang it. And when it comes to this kind of stuff, the invitation is always first and foremost, how am I going to live this out? What am I being invited into? What if I took my own psycho-spiritual training seriously enough to cultivate some of these facets? Not so I can put that on my tombstone and say, I did it. I nailed it. Whole, totally whole. Okay, that doesn't work. It doesn't work quite like that. But so you can be the generative presence that is so desperately needed in this very sick, patho-adolescent, egotistical, egocentric, sex, money, murder culture. That's the invitation. So we'll talk more about it next week. Thanks for listening.